We're good.
We're good. Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to our joint subcommittee on growing needs of transit noise, or SJ28 as some folks call it. And my name is Adam Evan, and I want to start by calling the subcommittee to order and asking the clerk to call the roll. Okay, so let's continue the roll. Senator Sturgill, Delegate Delaney.
Here.
Delegate Austin.
Here.
Delegate DeClerc.
Here.
Walter Alcorn. Here. Paul Smedberg. Present. Kate Mattice.
Here.
Tiffany Robinson.
Here.
Okay, and I'll just note that Delegate Austin is participating remotely, as is Senator Voicecode. I don't know if Senator Sturgill's online remotely, but we have two members remotely. We have an in-person quorum of 7 members, and Delegate Sickles will be with us shortly. The first item on the agenda is a report on the DMV Moves Task Force, and we have the co-chair Paul Smedberg here to start that, and I believe he's got a guest online in front of you.
Thank you, Senator Evan. Welcome, everyone. So the DMV Moves Task Force continues to meet as we work through regional vision of what should be for public transit in our area. Our advisory groups are continuing to meet in the summer ahead of the fall task force meeting, which is yet to be scheduled, but we do plan looking at dates as early as the first part of September. Nick Donahue, our DMV Moves facilitator, and I would now like to turn it over. Nick's okay. Turn it over to him to provide more details about our March meeting.
Well, good afternoon. Is that my cue?
Thank you, sir. Welcome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be with you all here this afternoon. Thank you, Chair Evan and Paul, for those remarks here. I've been asked to come give a quick update on DMV Moves. I know we talked with this group at your April meeting, and so I just want to give some updates on kind of where things are and have evolved since that time frame. So moving to the next slide, we talked a lot in April about like what is like the root cause of why DMV Moves was meeting, and again that joint initiative of COG and WMATA. As we talked about at that time, the core issue was not enough funding to be able to maintain the steady good repair of the WMATA system, as well as looking at some local transit needs. We talked about a rough number when we met in April. This slide here goes over a further refined number. And so what we are looking at now is a part of the WMATA need, and I want to stress that this doesn't include any local transit needs, for coming out of DMV Moves is around 450 to 500 million a year starting in FY28. This funding will accomplish a number of items that are pretty important. So first off, it will help ensure that we can maintain the current state of good repair of both the rail and bus system at WMATA. As we talked about in April, absent an infusion of additional dollars because of how the funding was provided in 2018, we will essentially start to lose ground on the progress that has been made with regard to improving WMATA's state of good repair performance. What this funding, though, also will do, and which we did not talk a lot about at the April meeting, and I want to just talk briefly about, is it will help WMATA implement rail automation and advanced signaling across its rail system, in addition to addressing the state of good repair of the system. So going to the next slide, rail automation is, essentially two words that cover a whole host of capital investments throughout the Metro Rail system. I want to focus, though, first on, instead of what is being built, on like what does it deliver. And so importantly, rail automation will dramatically increase the reliability of the Metro Rail system. Other systems that have implemented rail automation have seen service reliability as high as 99%. So that means no train breakdowns, no holding in the tunnel, other things of that nature. It also can create a more safe system, both through less train incidents, but by also reducing the amount of staff on the roadway and keeping trespassers and fires kind of out of the system there. It also increases capacity of the system, importantly, and I think that's not always clear on its face. So it doesn't add any additional track per se to the system, but what it does do is it allows the system to move more trains on the existing tracks and through the existing tunnels and bridges that it has. Collectively, these three things also help improve the efficiency of the system. And so overall, this will lower the per unit cost of providing a revenue hour of Metro Rail service by making that service more efficient, and also hopefully by increasing capacity will also provide opportunity to grow ridership and revenue. The next slide, I think, talks about why rail automation is something that's being talked about at DMV Moves. So WMATA has a signaling system today that was designed in the 1970s. Just to kind of put that in perspective, and there's a handy little picture, of course, on the slide there. The dominant form of communication in that phone was a rotary telephone. And if you kind of think about that compared to like the iPhones or smartphones, all of you all either have in your pocket or sitting on the desk in front of you, technology has progressed a lot since that time, but WMATA's signaling system is essentially the exact same. And so this system is aging. It is getting to a place where it needs to be replaced. Will start to, in the future years, if we don't replace this, run into issues with whether or not they're even manufacturers to make some of these systems. And just to kind of put a finer point on that, New York City is in a similar place, and because some of their signaling system is older, they actually have had to start to produce some of their signaling equipment in-house. That is not something that we want to have happen at WMATA. Next slide. I talked about how it can increase capacity. This chart here is supposed to help you understand what I mean when I say that. And so if you look at this slide, you see the blue charts, and you can see manual at the top and then fully automated at the bottom. Today, most of the system is operating in manual and has been doing so since the 2009 crash. Recently, WMATA switched the red line over into what they call GAO2 and that initial ATO there. But what you can see is in manual operations, it requires 30 trains to run 5-minute headways on the red line. And we're just using the red line as an example here, and I know it doesn't run to Virginia. At full automation, we can cut that number by 1/6. And so you can run the kind of existing service that you have with either less assets, or because you can run more trains through that system, you can redeploy those trains to increase frequencies and increase service along the system. The other thing that I think is really important on this slide is if you look at the blue bars, like that's the amount of time you as a customer would need to be on a train to accomplish your trip. And so someone who's heading from, say, Shady Grove to Union Station, if today their trip takes, give or take like 35 or so minutes, they'll be saving several minutes, potentially as many as 5 on that trip. And so to kind of like put that in perspective, like many of you know, in a past life when I worked at the state, reviewed a lot of documents looking at the benefits of projects. It is very rare to see projects where we see travel time savings of 10% or more than 5 minutes on a given trip. But that's what rail automation can deliver for users of the Metro Rail system. So I just want to kind of hit again on what rail automation means. And so when you think about the ask of the $500 million that we talked about, if you go to the next slide earlier, again, what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to ensure the state of good repair of the WMATA system. Again, we've driven down the state of good repair backlog from more than $7 billion in 2017 to around $4 billion today. With this funding, we will keep it or lower it from that figure moving forward, but it will also allow us to move forward with rail automation, making a needed replacement of the signaling system, as well as other enhancements that will provide real benefits to users of this system and to the communities that are served by it. I want to take a little bit of time before I conclude just to talk about what's really important in terms of the funding here. So in DMV Moves, there's 2 issues we've really talked about in the funding side. One is, what is the right amount of money? And for those of you who have been tracking this over the last 12 months, you know that the numbers come down dramatically as a result of a lot of this discussion at DMV Moves. But what's also important are the characteristics of that funding. To be very direct, one of the reasons we are having this discussion today about WMATA and have DMV Moves is how the funding was structured in 2018. So one of the biggest and most important things about any funding that is provided to address DMV Moves is we need that funding to keep up with inflation and grow at 3% a year. As a reminder, the 2018 funding is a flat, at least for Virginia, $154.5 million a year. And that has resulted in the inability to continue to sustain a state of good repair finance and bond program, which is why the capital program WMATA will be dramatically reduced without increased funding. We also need the funding to be bondable. That is really important. A core goal of the solution and the solve that we've been working towards at DMV Moves is that WMATA is able to create a sustainable state of good repair program so that we are not back in this same place in 10 years. And so we have worked with the WMATA team, particularly the finance folks, to look at the existing debt, look at the planned capital expenditures out past 2050 and how this new funding could work within there and create the ability so that they can always have a bond program to support their capital state of good repair needs at WMATA. And this last slide here just kind of shows you what that general breakdown is a year by the three funding jurisdictions. Again, this is starting in FY28. These are kind of approximate figures, but it's to give you kind of a rough sense of what we're talking about and what 500 million would mean in terms of a request to Virginia as a whole, not like the individual jurisdictions. Really importantly here, this does not include, VRE or other local transit needs. And these are approximate figures because they're based on the current FY26 capital contributions. I'm sure some of this will slightly change over the next few years, but this is, I believe, an accurate picture to give you a kind of a sense of what this would mean for Virginia in terms of a funding request. And with that, Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Did want to ask to start if you could explain a little bit more about on slide.
I apologize there, Chairman. I heard you say ask more about slide, and then it went silent for me. Senator Boysko, Delegate Austin, can you all hear me?
Mr. Donahue, I can hear you clear.
I think
They
it's
froze on me. That happened to you all?
It did.
awesome.
Okay.
I don't see them anywhere.
Yeah, I thought it was me, so I logged off and came back on, and then I noticed they were missing.
Yeah, they're still missing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I heard about half of what the chairman said, Mr. Donahue, and then I lost him as you said you did. So,
Yeah. So they're telling us that the Zoom connection dropped in the room and they're trying to get it back on.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator.
Technology.
Yes, modern day technology, not what the deputy secretary is trying to promote, but modern day technology. We're back to the rotary dial here.
I'm telling you, you don't want to see those signaling rooms. It is
I can only imagine.
Okay.
That's probably a very good comparison.
Yeah. So Nick, while we're waiting, this is 150 million on top of the 154 that we already do. Is that the request?
That is right. And so if you think back to 2018, if that amount had grown basically at 3% a year, this is almost where we would be there. There's some additional funding in there for the rail automation aspects of it. But the big thing is that the funding from 2018 never grew. So this is on top of that. Yes.
So is that the bond? Was that the revenue necessary to satisfy the bond issuance, Nick, or what is that?
Yeah, so that would allow you to have a sustainable bond program and do the rail automation. And again, the signaling system needs to be replaced no matter what. And so going in there and doing that, we kind of talked about this a lot. It makes sense to go in and do those other aspects so that you get the capacity benefits, you get those greater safety benefits and the efficiency benefits.
Thank you for answering that. I believe we're back on.
Let me call up folks. Nick, we've got you back online now. And Mr. Smedberg added that question that I posed, but we didn't hear your response here in the room about the savings from automation. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Paul, told us, about how the entire system is approved for, automated use, and the signalization system will save us money and trains and be able to get more people in the same number of cars. The more you wanted to add for us?
So, I mean, I think there's a number of ways in which rail automation could create savings for the system. I think just looking at this chart here, I think you need less cars to run the same service. So just from a simple capital assets, what do you need to be able to provide the levels of service that you're doing today with full automation? And again, the signaling system needs to be replaced no matter what happens. You are going to be able to provide service with less assets. And so you're lowering, again, that per unit cost of individual service. At the end of the day, again, it's going to be a decision of the WMATA board working with the community. It's like, what is the right service level that they want to provide? And so you could make the decision to have less rail cars and run the same level of service. You could make the decision to have the same number of rail cars and run more frequent service. I assume those will all be a big part of the discussion that folks will have. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think one of the things we've talked about a lot with WMATA is how can we make that service more efficient? And I think, what they've brought to us here with the rail automation proposal is one of the best examples I've seen of kind of a driving down overall the cost for kind of the unit of service that we're getting here, which again to me is like how many trains are we running and how much do we pay per hour to run them?
Thank you. Now, before I call Senator Boysko, I was going to recognize Director Robinson, and then we'll come back to Senator Boysko.
Senator, I was really just going to follow up on my question and ask if a dollar figure has been placed on those savings from automation, if all things stay the same without adding additional products, period.
No, Director Robinson, that's a great question. So WMATA is working on a detailed implementation plan for rail automation that will be going to its board in December. And so that will be available at that time. And I think we'll have more information on specific kind of expected savings and return on investment from the overall rail automation program.
Thank you. And Mr. Smedberg, if you want to follow up on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and Director Robinson, the data they're collecting now that we are in full automation for the system now, it's been extremely helpful to plug in to get to that number or estimate that.
Thank you. And I believe Senator Boysko had a question. Is that right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, while you all were absent for a couple of minutes, I asked Mr. Donahue a question about the final funding request of 150 million, clarifying that that was on top of the funding that we get. And I would like him to answer and tell the rest of you what he told Delegate Austin and me while you all were away. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Senator Boysko, for the question. And so the question was, we provided in 2018 the 154 million. Is this 150 on top of that, or does this kind of supplant that? And as I talked about, this money is an addition and additive to that 154 million. I think what's really important as we think about this funding request is if the amount we had provided in 2018 had been indexed to inflation, that would cover the vast majority of this 150. There is some additional incremental funding requested here, and that funding is really the money that is necessary to fully implement rail automation. And so on the kind of just the taking care of rail cars, track, and buses, if we had just increased the funding in 2018 by 3% a year, that would take care of that. But there is some additional funding in this proposal. It's about 150 million a year of the 500 that is there that is necessary to implement rail automation.
Thank you. We've got Delegate McClure next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just wanted to know if there's anything out there available to the subcommittee that details what automation includes, and if not, could we receive that information as it becomes available?
Yes, we can absolutely send some materials over, Doug McClure and Chair Eben. There was a pretty thorough presentation, again, at a high level that WMATA team gave to its board in late April that we can send over that walks through some of the various kind of capital components and other items. I do want to stress, as I noted earlier in response to Director Robinson's questions, that if you're saying like, how would it be implemented and which line would go first, or what are like in numerical terms the savings, that is the type of information that is going to be coming later from the WMATA team in December to its board.
For me, Mr. Chair, it's just literally what does automation entail, not just in terms of the cost savings or the details of that, but, you know, the list of what automation is. I know it's been discussed here and there, but just, it would be great to see the list.
Excellent. Yeah, so we'll get that and share with members as you know. Okay, any further questions for Nick? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Nick, as we talk about the estimate for WMATA, that you've identified on slide 7, looking at about 150 million for Virginia. I know one of the things that we've talked about, and I think like helpful for the group to understand, 2 years ago, the General Assembly passed additional money they moved over from the general fund to backfill some additional operating costs that our localities pay. Can you talk about where that 150 relates to that, or is that separate and apart?
Yes, thank you, Kate, for that question. That is a great question. That's very important, particularly for how the rebased operating funding was addressed in Virginia. And so this is in addition to that funding as well. So that is a separate issue. I understand that the way that was funded through the budget was a 2-year appropriation. So if you are a member of the General Assembly, you are going to hear from people in Northern Virginia saying it's both what Nick just talked about, but also this issue we've been talking to you about for the last 2 years. And so the cumulative total is probably twice that when you combine both the rebaseline operating amount along with this 150.
Thank you. Okay, yes, Supervisor Rob.
Yeah, very quickly. So, yeah, thank you, Nick, for that clarification. I think it's also true at the local level, that the rebaselining method is larger local substantive. So thank you for thinking we need to factor that in as we go. But also just a big shout out to Nick and the DMV Moves team and to the WMATA folks. This is super helpful to really start to get our hands around what the need is, what the, you know, what the solve is for Metro. And this is actually something I think we're going to be talking about more, but I would encourage all of us and others who have any issues with this approach, you know, to please, you know, bring it up, you know, let us know, because there is going to be additional information that's going to be coming in additional detail. But to me, this looks solid. It looks like, you know, a pretty reasonable identification after so, with the additional automation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions for Nick before we move on to our next presentation? Okay, seeing is there someone on the line? No.
I was just trying to see.
Oh, and Senator Servo's with us online. Senator Servo, you probably have seen the.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, it will be. Okay. We can move on to the report from the chair of the technical working group, and to the matter. Andrew, are you ready to report?
Yes, this will be a very brief report followed by much longer revenue. We'll go to the next slide. So the technical working group last met. We had very long, very deep technical conversations on the upcoming revenue sources, three geographies, which yields a very long list, but potential revenue estimates and a very long presentation. So it's good feedback about better summarize this information for the subcommittee, kind of narrative the structure of this conversation. So that's going to be happening right after I get the report out. One thing that came up at a staff level is that there was a very strong desire, mentioned for more information on the transit agency needs. That revenue estimates were incredibly helpful, but really taking time to dive into them is something where understanding the order of magnitude would be incredibly helpful in thinking about potential. So that's something that we want to acknowledge and note that there is, as Mr. Donovan mentioned, a significant amount of work already underway on those WMATA numbers. The VRE and Running Right are actively funding their needs, and that this subcommittee has agency needs as the main project number of the meeting. So a lot of work is currently underway to get to that point. Coordination moves. Who's also working on some local lead estimates as well. So we're collaboratively working with our transit agency, we're working here with, DMV moves from the months to help get, the information to that. I do also want to acknowledge that for the VRE system needs, there's an active conversation underway about the VRE 2050 system plan, both commissions anticipated taking action on that next month. Also thinking forward to September, the committee will also cover topics on cost containment. So that is kind of the cadence as we get look forward to September. I also want to remind the working group, or excuse me, the subcommittee, that in addition to the slides today, there are a number of meeting materials, including several memos that were talked about at the last meeting. Those were produced by the technical working group as well as Samada. They address different requirements in the resolution as well as topics of the subcommittee requested. So the technical work group has a great deal of work to do over the summer, and we look forward to really diving into those needs. After we've taken a deep dive into revenues and continuing conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. I do want to reiterate that we are going to have some tough decisions to make between September and November. Here for recommendations to be forwarded to the full General Assembly. Do members have any questions or comments at this point on what Andrew just shared with us? Okay, then I guess we are ready to turn our attention to a discussion of revenue estimates and structure led by both Andrew Vetter and Amy Masich of HPR. They will present, I guess that's one of the slides we got. And then if we can hold our questions till the end, just jot them down and we'll come to them at the end. Thank you.
All right, we share Evan. So go to the next slide. Before we dive into slide deck here, I do want to briefly step back, remind subcommittee members that much of the task is laid out. And then in this case, through NBC, VRE, and provide resources for technical support that's called basic PR. Then our task is to develop estimates for 15 revenue sources at 3 GR. But at the November meeting, the committee directed us on which 15 forward legal estimates. Other sources were discussed at that time and were not part of the 15. Several of those were part of the policy, and I mentioned meeting notices, packet. Next slide. So with 3 geographies, 14 sources where we ended up coming up with estimates, there's 42 potential answers provided by staff. That's a lot of information. So what we've done here is put it on a cheat sheet. That's this 11 by 17. This is kind of the quick reference book plans. That is intentionally structured. So the left side, the revenues are really high potential revenue, high growth. Right side is sort of low growth, low revenue. So really, in layman's terms, larger sources on the left, smaller sources on the right, and essentially are not precisely ordered in between. That's kind of the best way to think about it. There's a lot of information on here. Some of it includes the increments which we evaluated what revenue yield. So we often get small increments of 1%, or 0.1%, $1, or $10. Depending what we're talking about. And then again, there's new geographies, which I'll get momentarily. And then at the bottom, this is Nate can speak to later on in the presentation. The qualitative evaluation matrix we reviewed with the subcommittee last meeting, and so we're presenting that information based upon the qualitative evaluation. So rather than overwhelm you by going over all of those sources in detail, we've structured this deck according to this agenda. And if you're so inclined, PDF will be provided online on slide 9 separately, so you can jump around to the appendix and really and look at slide. So there are 3 geographies. You go to the next slide where we develop estimates. Those estimates are statewide and here at TC. We'll cover statewide a little further, but it's important to note that there are some protocols in statewide trends funding compared to need, and that does affect all agencies Commonwealth, including those specified in the Even for those from the Virginia agencies of transit, especially WMATA, their responsibility, between local governments. So looking at those geographies, we have NBTC and PRTC. NBTC, the governance funding and coordination role with WMATA, VRE, and local agencies. PRTC has a governance and funding role with VRE on the ride, and PRTC, unlike NBTC, directly operates. Both of these geographies, including statewide, are already using funding and are important components. And next slide. So talking about agency needs a little bit, this has already been discussed, I think, by Nick and others, but I do want to just very quickly go over kind of what we call the buckets of needs here that are being defined as we get to that meeting. So as was mentioned previously, there's that WMATA operating baselining, and that's an additional state and local funding that was committed in fiscal 25-26, where there's not an identified long-term source for those funds. And then, as Nick mentioned, that WMATA capital dedicated funding that directly on the slide before. And as mentioned, local bus, VRE on the right, these are all being developed. There are some challenges in kind of putting this all together that we're working through. Some of these needs have different scales, both in terms of geography, but in terms of time, and potentially in terms of kind of level of service assumptions. So we're trying to sort through all that so that we can summarize hopefully a much more simple look at what total needs are for our group. There are some other potential buckets that aren't listed on here that have come up. So I know something that come up in NBTC commission discussions has been, if there's any opportunities to provide the local governments with additional resources to reduce sort of pressure on the general fund resources. So at this point, I'm going to go to my colleague Nate to really take us on the revenue journey.
All right, well, thank you, Andrew. We'll go to the next slide here, and I want to acknowledge too, this was developed in coordination with Inland as well, their prime contractor for this work. There, Inland had a key role in leading the work that developed these. So I just wanted to was not able to come to the meeting, given the rescheduled meeting date today. We're not to acknowledge his contributions to the work. So we've got the list here of all the revenue sources that were evaluated, and we think that that's important framing for the various options that we were investigating in more detail as part of it. And as Andrew noted, if you're looking at this as a PDF on a computer, you're able to go to this slide, hyperlink to the details on each of these funding streams in the pack. What we're going to focus on during our presentation today is some of the takeaways that we've identified from evaluating these funding sources. So we're going to kind of cut to some of what we found with respect to analyzing these funding sources and share those findings with you today. We can go to the next slide and talk about, first of all, we need to acknowledge that some of these sources are already ones that we're using for statewide transit funding. So some of these are contributed to the Common Transportation Fund. And we want to, acknowledge which ones are already being applied on a statewide basis for that. And we did see some changes in one-time stopgap funding in FY25 and 26 that help support the WMATA. So that was matched by NBTC jurisdictions. And, of the 14 sources that we evaluated, 7 of them support the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. So we just want to provide that as context. It's important to keep that in mind because these are the funds you're already drawing from and need to be considered back with respect to changes for any potential funding source. So you can see what those all are in the table here, and what we're summarizing here is the revenue that's raised by each of these. So for each of these funding streams, we choose a basic revenue increment, which can serve as a building block for estimating how much money that funding source might raise. And then given that increment that we tested, how much is the low range revenue, how much is the high range that revenue estimate for that. In this particular table, we're looking at those revenue amounts on a statewide basis. And just to orient you a little bit on that first row, we're looking at retail sales use tax. So this is showing it for a 0.1% increment, or for 1/10 of a cent on every dollar of purchases. Sales tax could raise between 88.4 million and 95.7 million on a statewide basis. And then we're also analyzing how much the motor sales tax, motor vehicle fuel sales tax, vehicle registration fee, highway use fee, motor vehicle route tax, driver's license fee raise. I'll note some of these are on a percentage basis, some of them are on a rate basis, such as the motor vehicle fuel sales tax. You translated that to cents per gallon of gasoline or diesel that's consumed. And then, the vehicle registration fee, highway use fee, driver's license fee, this is how much you could raise for $10 fee on those. Just trying to provide a little bit of context there, maybe you can begin to see the range of revenues that might be able to be raised through the increment of tax that are plugged out on a statewide basis. Now, on the next slide, you can look at what these would raise. If we were to provide additional statewide funding, what if those funds were to flow through the Commonwealth Trust Fund in the way that revenues currently flow through that? So for example, in this case, we're looking at a hypothetical $100 million after off the top distribution. If that were applied to the Commonwealth Transportation Fund and flowed through the way that funds already flowed through that fund, what would it look like? Well, because of the way the CTF is structured, 51 million would go to the Highway Maintenance and Operations Fund, and 49% would go into the Transportation Trust Fund. And then from that, there'd be approximately 11.3 million that would go into the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. And we can see how using the existing waterfall within the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund, how much would go to local transit operating, local transit capital, DOD, NBTC, WMATA, TRIP, and special programs. So you get a sense of 100 million. If it were just to flow the way that the existing Commonwealth Transportation Fund, the net result for transit would be 11.6 million. And the amount going to WMATA, that would be about half of that.
And I think we can, yeah, quick. As we have noted in the one spot there, when we say local transit operating and local capital, that includes, that's cross-comp. So that includes local agencies like that, which are their connector, but also PRTC or Mass Transit or some rural paratransit providers that's statewide except for VRE.
So the next slide focuses in and says, so what if that 100 million, instead of applying to the Commonwealth Transportation Fund at large, is applied to the Commonwealth Mass Transportation Fund, so goes directly to transit? And here you can see how much would be raised after off the top distributions to various uses. So this is basically looking at the same uses as we saw in the previous slide, but you can see that this provides substantially more funding for those uses because we've specifically directed that 100 million to the various range uses. So similar proportions to what we saw previously, but higher amounts and more is going to transit than home. So we're going to talk next about the regional transit funding, and we're going to first look at the funding sources that are already being collected that pay for regional transit funding in across the region. So there's a number of different ways that funds are collected regionally to help pay for transit, and you can see that in the table. So we've got 5 columns across this table that show the various ways that funds are collected regionally in various jurisdictional approaches here across northern Virginia and the broader region. So on the leftmost column, we see the funding sources that currently apply to transit funding regionally, and then where those funds are applied. So for example, WMATA Capital, there's 5 funding streams on this table. 4 of those are applied to WMATA Capital. MBTA collects retail sales and use and a grantor's tax. NBTC collects a motor vehicle fuels tax. And PRTC, something or Rappahannock Transportation Commission, also collects a motor vehicle fuels tax. And then the commuter rail operations and capital fund, CROC, also collects a motor vehicle fuels tax, which is applied to its funds. So note too that MBTA and PRTC funds can be used for transportation purposes other than transit, whereas the funds for the others are direct to WANA or to NBTC for transit purposes, or to CROC for commuter rail operation and capital purposes. So next slide then looks at how much do these various regional transit funding sources raise. So in this case, what we're looking at is the four that support a regional fund. And we're also noting that how much the increment is that we assume, and how much funding it raises both for the NBTC district and for the PRTC district. So we're looking separately at how much money be raised within both of the geographic districts. We remember Andrew had a slide earlier that showed, the maps for which localities are assumed, or not assumed, but actually into those districts that the basis for the investment in have here. So retail sales and use, for example, you can see at the top, 0.1% increment of retail sales and use tax raises between $39.5 and $44.7 million in the NBTC district, between 17.2 and 18.5 in the PRTC district. You can compare those to each other, you can compare those to what might get raised on a statewide basis in order to evaluate the revenue stream, how much each of these raise. Also wanted to note that the WANA Capital Fund and CROC Fund do not grow, so increasing any tax increment will not grow those funds without additional changes to the code. We also, for this table, we excluded the motor vehicle rental tax because it's a statewide source that supports the regional fund, but it's in essence really more of a state tax than a regional directed tax. So we're going to look on the next slide at how do the rates that we're charging in Virginia, we add together all the various increments that we collect on both a statewide, a regional, a local basis, and compare those to what our neighboring jurisdictions in DC and suburban Maryland are charging. How do they compare? So that's what this table on this page helps to lay out. And it helps us to provide some context for where we are regionally with respect to these sources, because we want to be mindful of where our rates are competitively with other jurisdictions. In some cases where we're lower than our neighboring jurisdictions, that may be an option, an opportunity for changing a rate in order to address that difference and possibly collect more revenue and in alignment with what our neighbors are doing. The ones that are in bold here, we've highlighted them a couple of different ways. So there's a bulleted list on the side that says where the Northern Virginia rates are lower than DC or suburban Maryland. We've also put them in bold on the source column of the table. So for example, generally speaking, the income tax rates in Northern Virginia are lower than you see in DC and Maryland. And you can see how they pencil out here. Motor vehicle sales tax is one that's a little lower. Some of them vary a little bit. So for example, transient occupancy tax is lower in some regards, but that one varies by jurisdiction. So in some cases it may be lower, in some cases it may not be lower, particularly because Maryland has a relatively low rate on transient occupancy compared to DC and right, so helpful context for evaluating these, we can be mindful of our regional neighbors. So, in addition to the regional taxes that are already being collected, these are sources that have lower taxes and fees in Northern Virginia compared to use here current now. So we take what we learned in the last slide, we'll apply it here to indicate what we may be able to raise. And in some cases, these are existing funding streams, and in some cases, these are new funding streams. But the point of this is to say, if we were to put a stream in place and collect it on a regional basis, what might it raise? So just to note that to clarify, the ones that have a star next to them, a single star, those are sources that do not currently exist in Virginia. And the ones with a double star, which include the transient occupancy tax and the motor vehicle rental tax, those sources already support regional funds. The others either do not exist or do not support transportation purposes currently on a regional basis. So, for example, here I'll highlight the motor vehicle sales tax, for example. We looked at what a 1/10% on the motor vehicle sales tax could collect on a regional basis. So that ranges between 4.4 and 4.7 billion within an NBTC district, and between 1.8 1.9 billion within the PRTC district. So these things, again, have a sense of what these begin to raise on a regional basis as you look at individual options. All right, so then on the next slide, you want to look at potential new transit funding sources. So these are not currently used in Virginia at any geography. On either a statewide or a regional basis, with the exception of the highway use. This one's a little bit of a special case. Highway use fee is collected on a statewide basis at the moment. But we wanted to drill in on how much that could raise on a regional basis. If it were to be implemented. So, again, we're summarizing what these all raise. And in this case, not just on a regional basis, but also on a statewide basis, particularly for those revenue streams that don't exist presently. So highway use fee, we excluded it here because it already does exist on a statewide basis. But you get a sense of what that would raise regionally, and then what the other four streams on this table could raise on a statewide or on a regional basis. Well, another lens that we want to look at, and if you recall our last meeting over at ABTA a while back, we were looking at how we could evaluate these funding streams and some different criteria for evaluating the funding mechanism. So that included who pays for the tax or fee if it's implemented. We'll also talk some more in a moment about some of the other criteria that we looked at investigating for all these funding options. So we want to think about it in terms of the various funding mechanisms that you said were important to evaluate some. So we're looking at three different buckets of potential payees here: businesses, residences, and travelers. Travelers could be business travelers, it could be tourists, they are generally people who don't reside in the region and they're not businesses that are based in. And generally speaking, a little bit of gray area with some of these, but this is a general characterization of who would pay these fees. So the only two that cut across all three categories of payees here are the retail sales use tax and the motor vehicle fuels sales tax. There's a number of them that would be paid by businesses and residents, but not necessarily travelers. And that includes the motor vehicle sales tax, basically you're purchasing a car, auto repair labor tax, vehicle registration fees, highway use fees, a retail delivery fee, and grantor's tax. And then another lens is when residents or travelers pay, which would be parking sales tax or TNC sales tax, transportation networking company, Uber or Lyft type sales tax on those types of trips. And then we've got two funding sources that was paid by residents: income tax and driver's license fees. and two that would be generally paid by travelers exclusively, transient occupancy tax on lodging, and the motor vehicle rental tax. By and large, motor vehicles are mostly rented by visitors to the region, although that's one where admittedly there are occasions when residents or businesses might be renting vehicles, trucks. Another lens is what shifts travel behavior. So something that the subcommittee was concerned with was, can we use any of these funding sources in order to nudge people to use transit more frequently? So we're looking specifically at how we can shift behavior to use more transit. So the ones that would potentially impact people's ability to choose transit could include the motor vehicle sales tax, the motor vehicle fuel sales tax, the motor vehicle rental tax, the parking sales tax, and the transportation network company of Uber but sales tax. We also wanted to look through the funding lens of what's the impact on low-income individuals. So some of these, because of the nature of who would pay these fees or taxes, and the relative wealth and income that individuals have and their ability to pay would impact who would have a greater proportional impact on what they pay with these. So these would have a high impact on low-income individuals, two revenue sources: the retail sales and use tax, the auto repair labor tax. And then there's six of them that have a medium impact on low-income individuals. And we think that these would strike low-income individuals a little bit harder than non-low-income individuals, but at the same time, not to the extent that the high-impact revenue streams would impact them. And then anything else that's not on this list would be, we assess that to be a low impact on low-income individuals. So we wanted to focus in a little bit on some funding sources that reflect today's transportation trends. So we didn't get into these in detail yet, but I want to talk about these in some more detail because these are three revenue streams that are somewhat novel and present some options for us to consider in terms of new ways of addressing people's use of the transportation system. And we see examples of these. In the first case, Virginia statewide is a leading example of the highway use fee. We also want to talk about the retail delivery fee, which some other states have adopted, and then the TNC sales tax fee, which actually 18 states and DC have enacted. And want to talk a little bit more about these in some detail here. So the highway use fee, for example, is a fee on the use of the system by fuel efficient vehicles. So if you have in Virginia, the way this works is that vehicles that on average get better than 25 miles per gallon are basically assessed a fee on their relative difference between what they would pay in fuel taxes if they were similar to the average fuel vehicle in Virginia versus what these vehicles end up paying in motor vehicle fuel sales taxes. Because they're not paying those fees because they're not consuming as much fuel tax. So fuel taxes are a key component that supports the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, and the fuel efficiency of those vehicles means they end up paying less towards the Commonwealth Transportation Fund and less towards the transportation system than relatively fuel efficient vehicles. So the way the system has been set up is a higher fee for those vehicles that are more fuel efficient. There's also a flat fee that's paid for electric vehicles, which pay not consume any fuel, therefore don't do anything in the way of fuel taxes. So we have a higher use fee that's collected on electric vehicles as well. The retail delivery fee is a fee on package deliveries. So Colorado and Minnesota, when there's a vehicle, or sorry, when there's packages that are purchased through Amazon for delivery to, homes or businesses. There's a fee of about 29 cents that's charged on that package. It's an additional fixed fee per transaction that is to help pay for the use of the transportation system to get that package from the distribution centers to the ultimate purchaser of that item. And you know, it's generating a healthy amount of revenue, about 50 million a year for transportation purposes in Colorado. Colorado also applies that fee to food deliveries that happen through online apps. Minnesota does not. Minnesota has more restrictions on how much its fee only applies to purchases generally above $100. They end up excluding a lot of items that would not be eligible for paying the state sales tax, which impacts the overall revenue that is raised in Minnesota. You know, on a population weighted basis, Minnesota's structure probably raises about 60% of what Colorado does, because of the exceptions that it has. But both serve as potential models for use here doing that. And then there's also the TNC sales tax. A lot of trips are happening now via Uber and Lyft, and this is basically a sales tax on the use of those vehicles. So as I mentioned, DC is already collecting this, 18 other states are collecting this. And it's a percentage basis on top of what people are already paying for these. There are instances in the DC region, probably the closest we come to charging anything like this is there's a fee if you are coming to or from the airports that NOAA charges about $5 per trip. And but that's only for trips coming to or from the airport, and it is you know built in as a fixed fee as opposed to a percentage fee. So I want to pause right there just to see if there were any questions folks had about these, because these are a little bit more unusual than some of the others that folks may be more familiar with.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah, just a quick question on between the retail delivery fee and the TNC sales tax. Do either of those include retail delivery that includes food or instant product delivery? I know it's kind of a combination. Your orders should be through Uber Eats or something like that.
You said food, and what was the second category?
So like that instant product delivery, if you order something through Instacart.
Yeah. Yeah, so in Colorado, it does. It includes food delivery, it includes basically any sort of delivery that's making use of the highway system in order to deliver packaging. And they actually have a special exemption where if the delivery is not made by motor vehicle, such as if it's delivered by bike or e-scooter, or you know, walked from to the destination, the fee does not apply in that case, but it applies to Colorado to basically anything where somebody's driving a vehicle from forward delivering something, regardless of whether it's packaged food or groceries or what have you. In Minnesota, because they have $100 threshold that it begins to apply at, there's a lot fewer packages that qualify for it there. And it doesn't apply at all to food deliveries, but most food deliveries aren't over $100 anyway. So there's a couple reasons why they just don't get hit by the tax in Minnesota.
And to follow up on that, you said it was 29 cents in Colorado. Is that the same as in Minnesota, 29 cents?
Theirs is a little bit. Yeah, we go to the appendix on this. Get that information. Yeah. Pull up the slide.
Slide 49.
So actually, we go to, yeah, here we go. So yeah, here's the fees. So Minnesota charges 50 cents per delivery. Versus 29 cents in Colorado. For the purposes of what we estimated, in Virginia, the increment that you see is 10 cents. So you know, you can see what 10 cents in revenue we raise, if it's able to be presented in Virginia. Colorado indexes its tax, so every year that amount goes up. They round it into a full cent, depending on what consumer price index has been. Minnesota does not have the current tax in the fall. You can see here on this table some of the differences between what they charge. So in most cases, it's once per transaction, even if, sometimes you order from Amazon, if you deliver your order in 2 different packages, still only pay the fee once. So it's based on the number of transactions as opposed to the number of shipments for packages. And that's the same in both states, basically. Colorado is applicable to all deliveries by motor vehicle, whereas in Minnesota, it's just retail deliveries over $100. So the revenue in Colorado is 96 billion in 2024, versus 59 billion in Minnesota. There are the exemptions, so Colorado exempts from this fee any tax exempt items, any non-motorized deliveries, and any wholesale items from retail. So this ordering something that you can then be selling at retail later doesn't apply to that, and it's specifically for retail deliveries.
You know, they exempt pharmaceuticals.
I believe they do in Colorado, if they're a tax exempt item, which they must, but they are.
And I had a question about the PNC tax. I don't know what currently is charged for taxi cab rides that are traditional taxis in Virginia or DC for that matter. Is that tax, when you estimate it, does that include taxis or taxis already taxed separately?
So, we did not look at taxi, fees here. We looked specifically at what raised through, ride share type services from, Uber and Lyft.
Can we find out for our next meeting or when we get, just to know if we're being apples to apples, or if there's a reason that taxis should be treated differently than ride sharing? Be helpful. Yeah. Give us good information. Yes, Jake Pepper.
Nate, how are you defining businesses? Are you lumping everyone together, or did you differentiate between, say, small, like owner operated type businesses versus?
So for the purposes of the estimates that we made, we estimated what the revenue will be raised for individual funding stream without respect for business size and all. It's all based on, if you are charging for retail sales, what would it raise, regardless of the business size that, it hits. For retail sales too, we assume that the existing structure is in place in terms of what qualifies as a retail sales item. There's a whole Pandora's box of what, if you start to tax services, what does that look like? And we didn't change that at all. We just looked at what the existing structures are. For the purposes of characterizing who pays, we're just making a judgment about generally, it doesn't drill into specifics in terms of things.
Okay, so when you did your research, did any state drill down and differentiate between, say, size or type of service or number of employees, whether they're based there or not? Any of those factors?
Yeah. So, for the most part, we weren't looking at how peer states were doing things, but the exception to that was the retail delivery fee. And there are, looking at the Colorado and Minnesota models, there is a difference in terms of who this applies to. So each state has exemptions, in terms of, in Colorado, businesses with less than 500,000 in annual sales don't pay it at all. And Minnesota, business with less than $1 million in annual sales doesn't pay it. And then, if they're selling a product that's taxed and some other sort of special exemption, then it didn't apply to those businesses. But this is the best example of special exemption that was made with respect to who's charged what based on their business volume.
And one last question, the two examples you use there, is that because they have the most sort of advanced and thought out type of program in place, or are they considered the gold standard, or are the two you want to get?
They're the only two that presently exist, so all the above, I guess.
All right. Perfect.
I've got a weirdly specific question. If you were ordering Girl Scout cookies, the Girl Scout brings it to your house, obviously there's no vehicle involved. But I think the Girl Scouts now have online ordering too. Does that mean that, are they, I don't know if they're tax exempt or if they bring it to you in a UPS van, you get charged in those other states?
So I don't know exactly how that applies to if you were to order a box of Girl Scout cookies in either of these states. I guess my colleagues.
I'm thinking about a phrase in this.
Well, the good news is, in Colorado, you don't pay 29 cents per crate. Goes to the box, as long as it's all one transaction. That's an interesting sort of, specific area, and honestly, I know I've bought Girl Scout cookies online from folks who are selling them here in Virginia. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head whether the sales tax applies to them. I don't think it does, but it points to the fact that there are some very arcane details in some of these that, if you decide that this is generally worth pursuing, you gotta kind of run down some of these exceptions in more detail.
Sure. Yeah. Are there further questions at this point? Paul?
Yeah, one other question, going back to these two examples, since you highlight. How long have they been in existence, and what generally has been the experience? Do they meet their estimates? Do they go over, fall short? In general, what's been the review?
So Colorado's been in place for about 4 years. Minnesota, this was the first fiscal year that they have had it in place. So it took effect about a year ago, and so that 59 million in 2025, we're waiting to see when there's actual numbers available for the full fiscal year, how much Minnesota raised relative to what they estimated. Colorado, it's performed well relative to what they estimated it would raise. And, like 100 million is a meaningful amount of money for their transportation.
Thank you.
Delaney.
Thank you. I maybe a little bit more of a comment than a question, but one has a sort of thoughts. I think I'll kind of just put it out there. I'm glad you kind of delineated the types of revenue that it might impact residents versus travelers, because I think that there's something for us to note is I think a lot of us are very curious about just the pressures of increased property tax, kind of an interest in sort of diversifying revenue so that it's not solely as heavily reliant on property taxes as it currently is. And I think that, that concept expands to as we look at some of these state revenue streams. But I think also as we're in parallel here, thinking about this, particularly this region, just some of the uncertainty with the federal workforce and just the concerns that people have in this area. And I think looking for opportunities that can both diversify revenue streams, but also consider ways to take some of that pressure off the residents and spread it a little more widely to others who are using our infrastructure, but maybe aren't paying their share, I think would be more palatable in many ways. And I guess then kind of make a second point with sort of the shifting of behavior and just taking into account, I guess, kind of the climate that we are in with some of the workforce uncertainty, sort of the carrot versus the stick mentality of, how can we shift behavior? And, just to kind of, for us, I think as a committee here to take into consideration, if we want to consider more, making it more expensive to do certain things as a way to motivate people to do something else versus looking for other ways to kind of incentivize it. But I will say, if we do find ourselves in that position and consider some of these revenue streams, I think to also simultaneously think about the quality of what we're trying to shift people to, so that we're kind of asking for sort of a fair comparison of, it may be more affordable to do this alternate thing, but that we want to make sure that we're also investing in that alternate transit, such that it is actually a desirable, option, and we're using a little bit more of the carrot. So there's some thoughts for us to consider.
Thank you for these points. Was there more to your presentation, Nate? Another portion of? Oh, I'm sorry, there's a question from Supervisor Alcom.
Yeah, it's just on a previous slide, so. Somebody had asked. So, about the taxes. Fees, I believe in Fairfax County, it's a sale, application of sales tax. So you can make it, and we look at a $1 surcharge. Taxing charge. So, but somebody needs to. The other thing I was gonna, couple points on slide 18. This shows, it's a really helpful slide. Yes, on the income tax, are we not assuming that the corporate income tax is in play at all?
That's right, this is, I believe specifically, the person tax, it's not the court.
Okay, and is that something that we had talked about? I don't know if that's something. You say only personal.
On our, I think there was assumed in the initial, resolution, but, I don't know, just explicit.
I think it was assumed, I know in prior efforts, we put property side, I think we assumed personal forward.
Okay.
We may have also just called it econ, so I can see. Very confusion about what the team estimated was, personally.
Okay, and one other significant revenue source, I don't think it belongs in here, but I want to make sure somehow acknowledging or addressing its paradox. So as we look at what our passengers, obviously it's going to vary by transit system. It's going to vary by rail, bus, here is going to. But are we going to, I guess my question is, how are we going to either acknowledge that, or is that something we're going to talk about, or is that sort of going to be worked out in that what we're solving?
I think the Fairbox revenue is usually handled by individual systems, and there's some sensitivities to how much we increase it at what time.
That's correct. It is sort of the responsibility of the government agencies. I think maybe what we can do is help at least provide some information, set the stage. There are some, it's a fair revenue assumption, for example, automate, and say we find those numbers to kind of say that with the addition of that state and local funds, you know, they think they're in good shape on the operating side of the year. It does rely on certain, you know, increases that have happened up there about recovery, and our local systems are in a variety of places on that, and we are in a place, so we can perhaps help set the stage. If the subcommittee wants to make a statement about the importance of our broader solution, kind of recognizing that if you can pay velocity there, that's an option, I think I would tend to shout.
Yeah, I thank you, and I was hoping you might say something like that, because this is something I think we're going to hear a lot of folks bring up as just another effort to move forward. I think we need to have a position, and it could be if we end up with dedicated transit, what we're talking about. Some things like farebox revenue, maybe where there's little, you know, revenue, up or down over time. So, but I think it'd be helpful for us to be thinking about that at some time. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask Mr. Speckberg, has DMV moved, talk about that Fairbox revenue?
We did at one point. I'd have to turn to Nick to refresh my memory, but I know it has come up. And Mr. Chair, if I could,
Yes.
Nate, for the bond market feasibility, when you have that down here, is that because the houses with the street haven't weighed in on that yet, or haven't been presented with that say, opportunity or
Yeah.
been asked to make everything yet?
Correct, yeah. So with respect to bond market feasibility, most of these are yes, because you've had examples of these, including right here in Virginia, where you may already be borrowing against these revenue streams. Some of them that are a little more on the novel side are somewhat unknown. But I would say that to the extent that they're packaged into a consolidated fund, then it almost certainly shifts from unknown to yes, as long as there is that, you know, panoply of funds that's available to back that. We were trying to assess this, if the revenue stream were to stand alone, could you borrow against it? I think the reality is for a lot of our agencies that are borrowing funds in locally, regionally, and as on a statewide basis, for transportation, you're often borrowing against a mixture of funds, which presents a whole lot less risk to borrowers because they have multiple revenue streams that's backing that down.
Thank you for that. And the reason I asked is because when we had met with the bond houses, with almost every meeting, they do ask about, how are the states feeling, sort of the annual uncertainty, because we don't have a dedicated stream of funding. So they always ask those questions. It's sort of curious. What on your own? So possible.
Were there further specific questions for Nathan?
I had one clarification that I wanted to make in response to some questions we previously had, which is related to the parking sales tax. So something important to note with the parking sales tax is what we evaluated was what if there was a tax on existing paid parking, commercial parking. This is not a tax or fee on free parking or unpriced parking. It's not, we've also excluded from this metered parking. So, these vehicles out here that we see on the street that the public paid the county to park you'd not be collecting from them, but if they're parked in the building and they paid in an off-street garage, they would be counted in what we've estimated here. But we've excluded any paid parking that is associated with their residential lease. So some people, as part of their apartment rental, they pay a fee for a parking space. We've excluded that. It's on a percentage basis of what people are paying. And I think that those are some important clarifications, that this isn't a per space fee in dollar terms or anything like that. It's only basically a sales tax on what people are paying for off-street commercial parking.
Okay, and I've got one in the weeds on that. I've been to the baseball game with a friend who used an app to find a parking space at someone's home, which is charged them for through an app. And I'm assuming that's not really a large source of potential income yet, but is that something that could be included in that because it's done through a service that reports that stuff?
I think it could be. I know that there are a lot of there's a lot of commercial parking that happens through services like Parking Panda, where you basically pay in advance, and it's commercial garages where you can grab a ticket and pay with your credit card on a usual basis, but they have these QR code readers that you scan the app and you get into the garage. And there's a mechanism in place where those types of garages are already paying the sales tax. You can see, for example, on parking. That's all embedded in the fees that you're paying, where there already is a sales tax on parking in place. So I think that there's definitely a mechanism for those app-based fees to collect that, and it would just be a matter of, making the legislation that governs us in Virginia be specific to, those sort of technologies.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for me at this point? Okay, I think you appreciate the presentation, all these variables and different considerations that we've made. Andrew, there's something or?
No, just one last slide to close.
Sure.
Any Q&A. I'm on slide 20, just to sort of wrap up. estimates and the revenue presentation, we just want to put a little reminder here about how revenue structure. A thing to think about moving forward. We can't, as we talk about revenue estimates, we can't forget control struggle discussion that helps continue towards. Structure is important because it helps board of governance in accountability for funds. It can allow funds to be fundable or not fundable depending on how it is for appointed agencies and very or audit is very important. It's also important for DRE. Structure is also important because it can help make sure that funding is available to transit agencies, VRE, not just it also helps ensure that continuous partnership on funding transit is maintained while in for those statewide conversations with other partners that may also have similar problems. So this slide really just plants some seeds on major policy questions moving forward. We don't have to answer those now, but as more technical information becomes available, we'll continue to course. So some of the kind of major questions here are about, are essentially how diversified should funds be? Should these be new sources or existing sources? Should something be reopened or left alone, have things added to it? What's that balance between regional and statewide support? And then in terms of actually implementing something, there's a variety of options that include general solution, directing the solution, enabling the solution, with lots of pros and cons across the so this is something we'll continue to think about, but at this point, I back to the chair. We do have plenty of time who's been here for any continued discussion on both the technical or policy level.
You, we also have public comment on the agenda. Before we conclude committee discussion, is there anyone in the public who's here today to address us? Please come forward or if you want to stand, so be great.
Right now?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Good afternoon. My name is John DeRose. I'm with Enterprise Mobility. We own and operate the Enterprise, National, and Alamo brands. Our footprint is comprised of 150 locations, employing over 2,500 individuals across the Commonwealth. I'd like to begin by thanking the Joint Committee for their work supporting Ramada. We consider Ramada a partner. Strategically open some locations, very close proximity to metro stations in Northern Virginia. Today I'm going to try to provide a little additional context on the consultant report regarding the motor vehicle rental tax as presented to funding stream. First and foremost, the motor vehicle rental companies already pay a 10% statewide tax in Virginia on top of an airport surcharge at our airports across the state. Our tax revenue currently contributes to the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. 1% of this tax is Nevada capital. The motor vehicle rental tax is a statewide tax supporting a regional fund benefiting Northern Virginia. Other tax on top of the existing obligation would be duplicative. Second, the report indicated motor vehicle rental tax will primarily impact travelers. This is not our experience. In fact, 80% of our renters have a Virginia license. Though we do a lot of business at the airports of Northern Virginia, most of our customers interact with Enterprise at their local neighborhood location. 65% of these renters are replacing their own vehicle as a result of an accident or repair. Many of our customers already are carless and use rental car for long drive opportunities, hauling purposes, work functions, and weekend routes. If this revenue stream were adopted, these Virginians would be penalized. As such, we don't believe an additional rental tax would shift travel behavior. For the same reason, we'd like to address the report's finding that an additional rental motor tax, rental car motor tax would have an impact on low-income individuals. We strive to serve all communities across the Commonwealth, largely at our non-airport neighborhood locations. large percentage of the businesses that are transacted without a credit card in Virginia, as we have a large customer base that do not have any credit cards. Motor vehicles are even rented for folks who drive DoorDash, Uber, participate in the gig economy. We respectfully disagree with reports finding that all customers are tourists visiting the area and would otherwise take Metro if the cost of renting a car was too high. In fact, over 95% of our locations across the state serve local markets. Overall, we would respectfully request that you consider these points for your deliberation. We're grateful for the opportunity to provide input and would like to thank you for your work and report. Look forward to discussing these on committee over the next few minutes. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the comment that you built.
Any questions?
Are there questions? Yeah, I think you were pretty clear.
Yeah, sir. I think the big thing is those are business.
Yeah, if you don't mind, if there's a copy of the remarks,
I do. I think
you can
You can email them.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. So that was helpful. Are there members of the subcommittee who want to talk about revenue sources in particular at this point? Keep in mind, we're not going to make decisions, final decisions till November. But if you have reactions or questions, please further detail on this will be good. Yes. Well,
Thank you, Chair. I think, well, thank you for all of the information that you all provided. I think it's pretty thorough, especially the impact on folks. Two of the things in terms of my immediate reaction that kind of grabbed my attention was the impact on low-income individuals. For two revenue streams, retail sales and use tax and auto repair labor tax stood out to me. I think we should consider ruling those out when the time comes, since they have such a high impact on low-income individuals. On the retail sales and use tax, maybe remaining in line with what our neighbors are doing in DC and Maryland, maybe that's there. And then in terms of the auto repair labor tax, wondering about the impact to those who aren't located near transit, and may rely on the vehicle. So just some suggestions, I think we should consider at least ruling out those two because they have the highest impact according to the.
those who are repair labor tax and as well as sales tax. Yeah, I would just point out that we can take actions, but the auto repair labor tax is, while it's a high impact, is less of a potential revenue generator than the other. So I would be open to that. I want to hear from other members before we take any actions. And we don't have to do it this month, but we could. Okay, maybe we should just first Delegate Sipples and then Supervisor Alpha.
Let's supervise the first. Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to getting more information on what we're solving for, particularly from BRE and health plus systems. I think at that point, I would be more comfortable ruling things out. Certainly, the point you made about that they're, the impact on lower income. I think that's something we're going to have to take into consideration. And I think it's going to be, honestly, if we're looking at 150 million a year for Ramada, and if we're only looking at say another 50 million, that's one thing. If we're looking at another 150 or another 200 million, that's sort of, it really takes it a different scale. So I think, and after looking at the numbers, we may come back and say, need to look at something else. I don't know, in terms of costs. But yes, I actually am happy to start the conversation now on which ones make sense, because I think it's going to be important to have that conversation as we understand. So thank you.
Okay. Didn't miss this, but I think it's related. But I wonder if you separated the 153 million that we need for maintenance and 154 million we need for construction is two different challenges. And if we could handle the operations and maintenance with using our existing procedures, taxes, and just bumping them up a little bit to cover the inflationary impacts on the economy. And the benefit of that would be, it would be statewide, it would help everybody. It would provide us the money we need to form a model for existing formulas. And we could repair bridges in Grayson County at the same time or wherever needed. So we just look at our maintenance problem as an addition and as a program to help the whole state. And then MBTC jurisdictions deal with the other 150 million we need for the modernize our system, capital money we need, and where these taxes that we're going to put that might be new or different than what we've got to have before. You know, have a discussion about which ones of those we might need. Comment on the sales taxes, but everybody looks at that to solve things, including people looking at others we talk about the sales tax. But we also are going to probably have a local option for every jurisdiction to raise it for school construction. We passed that in the General Assembly, the government vetoed it. That'll probably be signed next time. So how many times can we go back to the sales tax? Again, you know, I think we could probably do it to keep things in close competition or uniformly with our two other jurisdictions here, the DMV. So that's something, but anyway, my main point I wanted to mention was, can we, you experts, solve our maintenance problem with our existing program, just upping the fees to account for inflation?
So, that takes us back to the statewide side, so I'm gonna attempt to let me know if I got this right. One, I think what you're articulating is the will not operate the rebaselining, half state, local. What if that were to be solved for on the station? Right. So that would be about 76 million. There's some sort of fudge factor there. And if you kind of go by these two slides, if you're looking at the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, you have to add 1.5 million for that and then have flow to get to that language. If you're adding, you go to the next slide, you go to the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. This slide, then you would add 165 million to CM.
Slides 11 and 12, we're taking that.
Then to get to that solution. Also recognizing it's a wide variety of sort of in between options there where something could flow to both, or you could have some sort of hybrid option. But you've heard that there are some roads maintenance.
Yes. So what would be, those are big numbers, what would be the increases in the existing fees that we need, let's say, the second number?
So I think probably go to some of the statewide, in the funding slides. So really anything in the, we haven't looked at it exactly. I think some of the larger ones, you know, shown on the slides, I think,
You go back 2 slides and see.
yeah, so you can kind of see an example. I think we can start to put this math together, right? That's the direction. That's my answer.
Well, I mean, how big a hit is that? I mean, is that politically feasible? I know that's not your job, but we gotta realize that we'd be helping the whole state. So we would have allies theoretically from everywhere, because there'd be money for transportation everywhere, would also solve our problem. So that's a huge hit. I mean, what are we talking about?
Well, I think it very much depends where from technical perspective, it really depends where. So 1.5 billion, that would be, I think that would be very large for CTF.
How much did we raise in 2313? How much was that total? We've had 2 major bills since then.
I think we'll get some math for our next meeting to further, perhaps a little bit more specifically, address some of the signals out of them. one second, I'll put that. These presentations have been really helpful. Thank you, for that. And our next meeting is not scheduled till September or something like September 17th. We're going to meet on September 17th at the WMATA building, on Eisenhower, or Mill Road now in Sandford, in Northern Virginia, headquarters building. And then after that, November meeting where we need to, be more defined in our solution. I just want to ask, Senator Boysko's been online. Do you have any comments at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just align my comments with those that we've heard. One, I think it's important that we consider the people who are having, challenges financially. I think that a side approach makes most sense, to be able to rise all the boats throughout the Commonwealth. Specifically, WMATA does benefit the entire Commonwealth's economy. And just look forward to learning more and continuing to consider this and seeing the hard numbers as we make those final decisions. Appreciate all of the presentations today, and sorry that I could be with this afternoon.
Thank you, Senator Boysko. I don't know if we have anyone else online. I think Kelly Dawson dropped off.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yes,
Yeah, just quickly, I appreciate Delegate Sickles and his comments. I mean, one of the things that's helping me think about this is we've got two big issues. We've got the need for capital investment, primarily in WMATA, and thinking about that as basically a long-term investment that's going to help us with efficiency. Let's still keep it going. Safety, absolutely, all those things. That's helpful. And then we have the rebaseline issue. And as we think about that, and that's operating coming from the state, but also local. So as we think about that, I think it's helpful to think, it looks a little different, it feels a little different at the local level, state level, so it operates. And I think as we dive into that a little bit, I think it's helpful for me to think about it as an opportunity to learn. As much as it is plugging the hole. How we pay for some of this operating maybe needs to be updated. Maybe at the state level, maybe not, but certainly at the local level, one of the things I know a lot of my peers are very interested in finding a way we could get dedicated funding for operating, at least at the local level, that would relieve the burden on competition schools, on competition fire, services. I think it's a good conversation. Appreciate you framing it that way. That's what helps me.
Sure. Yes, and then Walter, yeah, they're the indexing. Absolutely. I mean, we cannot. I mean, if we had indexing, we would probably be here right now, potentially, possibly. But we can't forget that aspect. Whether that's a 2A or a 3 by itself.
Thank you. Okay, I have a lot to think about, and during the interim before September meeting, our staff was offered to brief staff from the Money Committees in Richmond to get some further reaction and share with them some of the things that could benefit the state as a whole. We'll do, and look forward to seeing you on September 17th. Is there any other comments before we adjourn? Okay, with that, we are adjourned.